I just want to read out a short passage written by Cottrell on what the scholars thought. I really recommend that you go to the Spectrum website and download Spectrum November 1980 from the archives. You may need to sign up. I don't think that necessarily means membership, but they'd like that, in order to download those documents. But there's a lot of good material in it. Anyway, this is page 22, Spectrum, November 1980. At Glacier View, the Bible scholars had expressed themselves freely on all of these points, in the study groups and in the full assembly and in the guarded language of the consensus statement. The 10-point critique did not emerge out of the week-long, painstaking process of consensus building. It was not voted by the Sanctuary Review Committee. Since Glacier View, the Bible scholars have been represented as saying the precise opposite of what they actually did say there, emphatically and repeatedly. Little wonder that many scholars feel betrayed by being represented as willing accomplices in condemning Ford, and that many of them have drafted letters of protest. All but 2 members of the Department of Theology at Southern Missionary College signed a letter to the President of the General Conference asking a series of questions that reflects their dismay at steps to discipline Ford. And I mentioned, well, I may not have mentioned, but Southern Missionary College was the one college where Des was not invited to speak because of the rumours that flew around because of the right wing. Yet they sent a letter, and some of them lost their jobs. So that's evidence from Cottrell that many of the scholars did not agree with what the administration did. Now I want to speak to you about Adrian Sikorsky's interview with Desmond Ford. As I say, I've just read this all out, now I've got to do it again. I'm not reading the whole thing, I'm just giving you a sample. And I want you to look at how reasonable, how Christian, how forgiving, how clear Des speaks in this interview. Spectrum. After 30 years in the ministry of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, how did you feel when you actually received word that you were no longer a minister in the Adventist Church? Ford, it did not come as a surprise, because Australia had pledged itself to follow the Council of the General Conference. I think actually it was more like the General Conference followed Parmenter. But I suppose it's impossible to answer your question properly unless I briefly touch on the theology of church ordination. The Seventh-day Adventist institution movement is a divinely raised institution to do a special work, but the church is a much bigger thing. It is composed of all who trust Jesus Christ and his merits. And the ministry, according to the New Testament, is a priesthood of all believers. While some are delegated to specific tasks of leadership, the New Testament knows no such division as between laity and clergy. That was brought in as a part of the great medieval apostasy, which resulted in the blunting of missionary endeavour for hundreds of years. A professional elite was given the task of spreading the gospel. One of the missing links in 20th century evangelism is the failure to restore the New Testament witness about the nature of the church, the nature of ministry, and the stress on the priesthood of all believers. As far as I'm concerned, I think of the poet Whittier's words, "Mine, the mighty ordination of the pierced hands." While there is definitely a regret, because of the bonds of fellowship with my brethren in the ministry these many years, it would be untrue to say there had been emotional trauma involved, because I see the issue of church and ordination in terms of New Testament positions rather than traditional ones. I'm going to be stopping while I look for things that are of most interest. Just a few things. Spectrum, I would now like to go back to that fateful meeting of October the 27th, 1979, when you accepted our invitation to speak at the forum meeting at Pacific Union College. Do you regret that you accepted our invitation? Ford, I regret that many good people have been hurt by what I've said, but I could not truthfully say that I regret taking the meeting. It seems to me that this trauma was necessary to lead a Laodicean church to a deeper biblical study of topics long held as foundations, but of which have received no treatment for years, many years. The subject of the sanctuary and the investigative judgment is not preached in the church, and scholars have not written on it for decades, with the sole exception of Dr. Hebenstall, whose presentation was hardly traditional. These have become dead-letter doctrines in the church, yet we hold them at the masthead when they are threatened. I regret that I have been the cause of bringing sorrow to many sincere people by making it appear that I was disloyal to the church, when actually it was a loyalty to the church that led me to make the statement. But I do not regret the meeting, because I believe it will bring good in the long run, as men and women are led to study the scriptures again, on the Bible relationships among the themes of the Old Testament sacrificial system, prophecy, and the gospel. Spectrum, do you think that that meeting was the reason you have been deprived of your ministerial credentials, or were there other reasons? Ford, I think it would be too simplistic to say that the talk was the reason. You and I have heard many strange things in some forum meetings. As a matter of fact, I think I was told that this was the place to say something that perhaps could not be said elsewhere. Probably the basic reason is that there have been many opposed to my stress on the primacy of justification. It has not proved possible to expel me on that basis, though many have felt over the years that I should be, because this stress too seemed a challenge to traditional Adventist thought. Over the years, I've had a lot of opposition in this area of justification by faith. I think there are some good, earnest Adventists who feel it was providential that I spoke as I did in that forum meeting, thus giving a lever for my removal from the ministry. To my mind, that could only be a blessing and a safeguard. One of the criticisms that has been made quite frequently is that if you had not allowed your sanctuary manuscript to get out, the church would have been able to solve this problem in a more quiet and satisfactory way. How do you respond to this accusation that you are not really playing as a team man? Ford, I did not leak the document. I had never at any time given the document or sections of it away to anybody. I have been very, very careful and have very close, intimate friends who would have loved to have had the document ahead of time or chapters of it, but the document did not get out through me. However, it would seem to me that it's a medieval mentality to think that truth can be kept in a corner, or that even criticisms about truth could be kept in a corner. As long as we treat the church people as children, they will behave like children, not gather to themselves the burden a responsible adult should carry in taking the gospel to the world. Spectrum, time and again during the past few weeks, you have expressed your confidence in our church leaders. Do you maintain this confidence? Do you feel they treated you unjustly? And there's a difference between how Des feels about this and how I now feel. But you've got to love his attitude. Ford, no, I do not feel they treated me unjustly. I have confidence in their well-meaning intentions. I do not have great confidence in some of their understandings of the Bible. I must be frank about that. My experience in mixing with administrators from the top down is that these men mean well, but are tremendously busy. In other words, the urgent takes the place of the important. An administrator is like a man in a swamp, with his rifle raised, picking off the alligators one by one as they come towards him, instead of being able to get out and drain the swamp. It is the great gulf fixed between administrators and scholars that is the root of the problem. I see no malice in the men who dealt with me. I have the highest of regard for the men with whom I associated. Spectrum, just shortening the question. The opportunity that occurred on Friday morning at Glacier View, when we understood you'd already indicated you could support and preach the consensus statement as you understood it, and it was voted by the people there. In your judgment, why wasn't the process ended there? Why didn't everyone just go home and say, we have problems that need further study, but we have unity on the important issues? Ford, I expressed my willingness to bury the sanctuary topic. I mentioned to the brethren in whole assembly there that I had only spoken publicly on the issue once in 30 years, and that by request. On Friday afternoon, I expressed to the brethren that met with me, a little group of administrators, there were no scholars there, that I was quite happy with the essence of the consensus statement and could preach it in sincerity. This they found very hard to believe. So it seems to me that there must have been some other issues. Spectrum. I would like to come to those other factors in a moment, but first one more question regarding the process at Glacier View. How could the brethren have responded differently to the events at Glacier View? I'm going to leave that bit out. In the months prior to Glacier View, I heard you indicate several times your belief that the theologians and biblical scholars in the church were in essential agreement with your position. Yet published reports from Glacier View seem to indicate the opposite. Was your assessment of the scholars' position in error? Ford, I would agree with Dr. Ray Cottrell's appraisal of that situation. He's gone on record as saying that 90% of the scholars would agree with the main essence of my positions. I know personally from talking to these men over a period of about 25 years where many of them individually stand. Now I could name men that do not stand where I stand. For example, the men whom I understood had the most to do with the special issue of ministry, men such as Drs. Shea, Hazel and Damsteed. These are diligent scholars who I personally respect who would not agree with my positions, but they are a minority. I am quite certain that the majority of theologians and biblical scholars do hold the major positions that I hold. I could name the men who've individually told me so. The real problem with Glacier View is that these scholars did not feel that an hour or two a day in the large meeting over 4 days, that they had any chance of educating those who had not previously been confronting the issues. The scholars spoke up more freely in the small committees, but some of the things they said were not understood. The reaction of the scholars since Glacier View shows that this assessment of mine is correct. There have been letters, as you know, from several of our educational institutions and from individual scholars which have protested that the administrators did not rightly interpret the low-key protests uttered in the small committees. Spectrum. Many people, Des, and this is the last section, but it's quite a big one. Many people, Des, after reading your response to the letter that you received from the Australasian Division, have been unable to understand why the General Conference recommended, despite your apparent effort to be responsive and conciliatory, that Australasia remove your credentials. Someone said to me there must be a missing link somewhere that would help him make sense of the sequence of events. I have a feeling that the missing link is best found by looking at the role and influence of Robert Brinsmead as it relates to our church and its leaders. Is such an analysis valid? If so, can you clarify for me and for our readers exactly why Brinsmead and your relations with him seem to be so important? Ford, this is a sensitive area and probably a key area as you've suggested. It's true, for a long time I've been under pressure to speak against Robert Brinsmead publicly. I've refused to do this. It's helpful to know a little bit of the background. I first met Robert Brinsmead when the division called me back to Avondale to complete a degree after about 7 years in evangelism. At that time, Robert, following extreme traditional Adventism, believed that a type of perfection somehow had to be reached by the time probation closed. Otherwise, we would never be able to stand without a mediator. For the next 10 or 11 years, I fought Robert very strongly. We lost hardly anybody from the ministerial working force or the student body at Avondale, though Brinsmead literature was pouring into the college over the period of a decade. It should be noted that while I engaged in polemics with Robert, we were not personally alienated. He and I met on various occasions to make sure we understood each other. Some years later, when I was in England doing his PhD at Manchester, the brethren called me to be present in Washington, D.C., in a week of meetings involving General Conference officials and Robert. After I got back to England, Robert wrote me and said he'd given up his old perfectionist teachings, the doctrine in which the unconscious mind was the sanctuary to be cleansed by the latter rain, in connection with the investigative judgment. I hope I can find my place. There was a knock at the door, and I got a big bunch of flowers because it's my birthday. And they're from Elaine, who's in America. Thank you, Elaine. Aren't they lovely? Bob had given all that up, and I rejoiced. It should be noticed that among the last published statements regarding the church and Brinsmead was a statement that conversations between the church and Brinsmead were proceeding in an amiable manner, and probably I was in some sense the most amiable. While opposing Bob's old positions, I knew him best and understood his positions best. But then we fell afoul of the review, which seemed to have disinterred the perfectionist bone that Robert had buried and was flaunting it before the review readership right across the world. While the review in the 60s had opposed perfection, the review in the 70s advocated perfection and also the sinful nature of Christ. So these issues have caused an upheaval right around our world field. And it seems to many that Bob and I are in collusion to wreck the church. This has never been true at any time. Bob and I have maintained an open attitude. I find he's been most thoughtful in not trying to embarrass me. We've had almost no contact during the past year. Bob and I do not agree in everything. Bob has taken some position on apocalyptic that I think may only be tentative on his part, but with which I wholeheartedly disagree. And he goes on to talk about what those things are. There's no personal antagonism between Bob and myself, even though most of the time we've differed. But many people have forgotten this past, and the fact that I now do not find it in my heart to damn Bob is looked upon as a very heinous thing by administrators. They would stress the necessity of being loyal to the church. It seems to me that Bob Brinsmead is still loyal to the truth of the Church Universal as he understands it. The reason he was not rebaptized, as Elder Pearson recommended, was because, to quote his own words, I made many mistakes, did some things I regret, but I never apostatized from Christ, and I'm prepared to take that statement at face value. I could not find it in my heart to go publicly against Bob, lest it be misunderstood, as though I was trying to repudiate his emphasis on righteousness by faith. I can only agree wholeheartedly with that emphasis. And I'm going to finish there. The interview goes on for pages. but I've made a few points. And I just wanted to go back to the issue of the review. I'd never quite seen it that way, how in the 60s the review opposed perfectionism, and in the 70s it did the opposite because of the changeover of leadership. And of course that group linked Hans, that was Kenneth Wood, and Douglas, who wrote the Sabbath School pamphlet in 1973, linked Hans with the old guard in Australia, Elder Pearson and Elder Willis Hackett in America, and Colin and Russell Standish, who caused a lot of dissension. But of course it all depends which side you're on. But at Glacier View, that dissension was never, ever mentioned. Thank you very much.